Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Marian Edmonds-Allen. I'm from Parity, and my co-host here is...
I'm in Derek Monson with Sutherland Institute.
And welcome, everyone. Derek and I are both actually in Utah right now, and we are sorry to not all be together in New York with those of you who are with us today. But we're so glad that you're here today, and we want to first of all say thank you to NGO CSW Forum for inviting us to present this workshop and for giving us the opportunity to do this virtually. Now, that said, this is the very first time, I won't speak for Derek, but this is the very first time I've done something like this. So the technology is new to me, and I am in my home office, which means that there may be a small puppy that comes running in, and if so, I'll show you the puppy. So any chaos that happens, I apologize for in advance and ask for your patience. A bit of housekeeping. You will see that you have the ability to type out questions for us and to send them. We will be having a question and answer time at the end, so feel free to send a question that you'd like addressed at the end. But if you have a question that is going along with what we're talking about, please send it and then we'll answer it as we go. Derek and I will be talking about how we met, how we've worked together. We'll give some real life examples. We'll talk about our own individual process for bridging divides, and then move into question and answer. We'll be together for about an hour or so. And first of all, I want to invite Derek to introduce himself and talk a little bit about Sutherland as well.
Sure. So I work for, again, Sutherland Institute, and we're located in Salt Lake City. I'm actually broadcasting from my house today due to COVID-19 coronavirus shutdowns, basically, of the whole state. But I've been working there for 13 years now, and my title there is Vice President of Policy. And we're a public policy think tank, conservative organization, nonprofit. And so we do a lot of policy research and try to inform and be a servant to policymakers and the public in terms of informing debate and dialogue, and and promoting conservative principles as well. We've been very involved in the issue of religious freedom over the years, and as issues that touch on that, which have included LGBTQ equality, rights in housing and employment, and other areas where there's debates about what the law should be, and how we protect everyone's rights, whether you be someone of faith, someone in the LGBTQ community, or both. And that's kind of where my work ended up intersecting with Marian. And I know we're going to get to that in a minute, so I'll hold off, but that's who I am.
Awesome. Thank you, Derek. And as I said, my name is Marian Edmonds-Allen. I'm the executive director of Parity, which is a faith-based LGBT advocacy group based in New York City. And we do nationwide work. I have a home in Utah and I office out of Manhattan. And I spend a lot of time, or have spent a lot of time, all over the country now at home with my family, and thinking of everyone who's impacted by this, and appreciative of all the texts and emails that I get from people just checking in and saying, hey, how are you? How's your family? And so I appreciate how, as a society, we're coming together to support each other, which is our topic today. How can we bridge divides that we have? And I think that our current circumstances of uncertainty naturally bring us together, which is something that perhaps we can learn from. It's something that Derek and I have done, collaborating over different issues of importance. And here we have one that's a huge issue for all of us in the world. My approach to bridging is curiosity. And I first got to know Derek because I was working on LGBT youth homelessness in Utah. And at the time, people didn't believe that there were youth experiencing homelessness. And so I would have different rallies. I'm an activist, I'm an LGBT activist is what they call me. So I'd have these rabble-rousing events, and a lot of press would be there, and we'd shout and and stir things up to some good effect. But I found that I wasn't able to get things done that I needed to get done, that there still weren't shelters for youth experiencing homelessness. So I started thinking, how can I approach this differently? I'm not having the results that I'd like to have. So I thought about, okay, who do I know in Utah that has power, that has influence? And I thought of the Sutherland Institute, which was known at the time as a very conservative think tank with a lot of power in the state. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to reach out to them. And Derek, I don't know how it was that I landed on you. I must have looked you up and thought you looked friendly. But and it was true. I emailed Derek and said out of the blue, would you meet with me to just get to know each other? And Derek, do you remember that at all? I'm wondering.
Yeah, so my memory was primarily with Laura Warburton, who was a
Mm-hmm.
kind of a mutual friend of ours. She's a conservative woman, but she's worked with Marian in a lot of ways. And I remember her reaching out to me and saying, "Hey, I have this person I think you ought to meet with. I think you guys could have a productive professional relationship and do some interesting things together." And then kind of set up that initial meeting. So I don't remember a particular email from you, but it probably was because maybe you got both, and I just remember the one from Laura because that's what actually led to the meeting or something like that. But it's interesting too because in the background of Sutherland, is not very different. I mean, than what Marian just described, but just in the area of religious freedom, right? We've worked on that issue Sutherland's been around for about 25 years now, since 1995, and been doing religious freedom work for most of that time. But we also discovered a handful of years ago, that the current approach, what's described as the culture war, wasn't being productive. You might be able to get a victory here or there, but oftentimes it's temporary. It's not something that ends up being sustainable or lasting. And oftentimes what happens is nothing. That's the most often the outcome. And so we kind of reassessed and said, okay, if we really care about religious freedom, we actually want to be protecting it in significant ways and making steps forward. And so we just kind of had a gut check on ourselves and decided that required in the kind of the political climate of the modern time that we need to be able to find ways to craft accommodations, compromises while maintaining our principles in areas that have other rights that people have and should have in addition to religious freedom. And one of those, and this isn't the only one, but this is obviously the one that gets a lot of the newspaper headlines, is LGBTQ equality and rights. And how do we find a balance and be able to protect both religious freedom and the rights of LGBTQ individuals? And so, and that was kind of around the time that I ended up meeting with Marian through Laura, and then it just kind of took off from there.
Yeah, it's interesting that I forget that Laura was part of that initial conversation, because I know she was later on. And that has been the way I've found is really effective in approaching new relationships with people who may be afraid to meet with me or be friends with me, is to find someone that they're already a colleague with or someone that they know and respect, and see if I can get an introduction or see if I can get a meeting together, because that can be less scary than just meeting someone who you think is, really different, who has totally different ideas than you do. And I think we've done that over the years, Derek, haven't we? We've set up meetings where I'll say, hey, would you please meet with so-and-so? I'll be there too. And
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think it's a great way to expand circles and to find that actually these folks that we think, they're so scary, I don't even want to sit in the room with them, find that we have things in common that we want to work on together.
Yeah, and I think it's the way this kind of work spreads, right? I mean, if it's up to just an individual to go out and establish friendships or relationships blessed by difference, you can do that, but it is kind of intimidating every time because you don't know when the individual you're reaching out to might not have an interest in that. If it ends up, maybe even turning into unconstructive or negative interaction. But when you have those associations already, and you have trust there, and those people are reaching out to folks that they trust and putting them in contact with you, it just smooths kind of the path, and it's almost like it magnifies the influence of that relationship. And I think it's probably the best way, at least the best way that I've experienced, to actually establish new connections that way, that end up changing hearts and minds about people who think differently, or different lifestyles, or different kind of fundamental beliefs or identities. And it's certainly, I think, more productive than I guess cold calling people. I mean, I think that's still useful. I'm not trying to criticize that. I mean, obviously, Marian, you said a minute ago you tried to cold call me, right? But if you can have someone who can kind of effectively establish the trust before you have that interaction, because you trust that person and the person you're meeting with trusts that person, then you've just you've gotten a step ahead from the beginning.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So Derek, I've admired your framework for bridging, what you call your chief framework. And I wondered if you'd talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, okay. So in the vein of this new technology, which I have never used either, me and Marian discovered a few minutes ago that you can actually share information on a screen with everybody watching. So I'm going to try that, and hopefully it doesn't crash the whole meeting. But what I'm going to share with you is just an op-ed version of what I'm going to be describing. For those who want to kind of read it, it'll be available. And should be showing up there. So, sorry, let me scroll back up to the top here. So the acronym that I kind of came about through my interactions with Marian was CHIEF. And so it starts with courage, right? You have to have the courage. And I mean, if you want to have, I guess is all presumed on an interest in having relationships with people who think differently and seeing the need for those relationships. So again, in the context of what Marian and I have described, trying to accomplish things in religious freedom, in LGBTQ rights, I think this applies to things such, dealing with gender, in all aspects of gender issues in public policy, and lots of others like immigration or other controversial issues. You're going to have to find some compromises if you want sustainable solutions. That's just kind of a fact of life, really. You might be able to get a temporary victory, and temporary might mean like 5 or 10 years. But at some point, if you don't have a consensus on what you're trying to accomplish, you're either just biding your time, or oftentimes what happens, I think, we end up sowing the seeds or giving other people the tools to overturn the outcome we want through the way in which we pursue it. In any case, so with that as the background, that's what people want. Here's kind of the framework, I think, for establishing those relationships to go after those sustainable solutions. And it starts with courage. So part of this is you're going to have the courage to stand up to people who think the same way you do, your friends. So when Sutherland started doing some work with Marian on LGBTQ issues, one of the first pushbacks we got, or questions that were raised, or criticisms, was from people who we've typically worked with on religious freedom issues. They started wondering, what are you guys doing? Why are you guys doing this? Are you starting to? People just start to interpret it as, oh, you're turning on us. You're losing the cause. Marian, are you there?
Yes, I'm back now. Sorry, our internet went out.
Okay, that's right. At first I was wondering if the whole thing was gone and I was just talking to nobody, but I think it was still going. So yeah, you're gonna have to have the courage to explain to people that are your friends, who think the same way you do, why these relationships are important, why they actually promote the principles and the values, or protect the groups of people, whatever cause that you're a part of, why it advances that, to have relationships blessed by difference, and to be working with people who would typically you would disagree with on a lot of things. And then you also have to have, I think, the courage to stand up and say when they promote an idea or say something that's factually inaccurate about the other side, if you want to maintain these relationships and have them be trusting, you're going to have to be able to speak up to those friends and say, hey, that's actually inaccurate, and here's why. And that's a hard thing to do. Frankly, it's much easier to call out somebody you disagree with, who you don't have a relationship with, who, as you just see as an opponent, you kind of objectify in some way as just being either an opponent, an enemy, or something like that. It's not, frankly, that hard to say, you're wrong, and here's why. Because it doesn't really cost you much. If anything, it actually, it might bolster relationships with people who agree with you. But to go in the opposite direction, to stand up to your friends who are saying something that's not true, or going down a path that isn't a good one for society or for your group or whatever, that does take some courage, because you might lose it. You're risking a relationship by doing that, potentially. I think as most often, it actually doesn't end up destroying a relationship. In fact, it improves it over time, because people respect you for being willing to stand up for things that are right. But it does take courage in any case. So the second letter, H, is for humility. And this is really a humility about what we think we already understand. So, oftentimes in at least here in America, right, in the politics we deal with, we think we understand the other side. And it's usually an understanding based on something derogatory about the other side. Either they don't understand something, they're not educated, maybe they're just malicious people, maybe some combination of both, or something else that just is, we're not really seeing them in the way we see ourselves, at least. And then when you start to establish these relationships with people who do think differently than you, or who live differently than you, believe differently than you, you're going to have enough humility to recognize the ways in which you're wrong, which your beliefs of the past have been inaccurate. And that's not a condemnation of anybody. That's a human reality, right? We all have beliefs that are wrong. It's kind of part of life. You end up learning and changing your views. But that does require, again, a recognition that you are wrong in some ways, and just it's a matter of figuring out what ways those are. And setting aside the natural kind of either defensiveness that would lead you to want to be, kind of arrogant about what you think is right. And despite whatever facts might be out there, those facts are all wrong, or things like that. Because you do face those things when you start to get to know somebody who has a different life experience, for example, start to learn things that you didn't understand before at all. And you maybe start to have some empathy for different life experiences, which then forces you to then raise some questions about other thoughts you've had or beliefs you've shared or promoted publicly, even about people in those circumstances. And again, that just requires humility to work through that. The I is for integrity, and this is about kind of an integrity of how we apply our standards, our views, our ethics to ourselves in the same way we apply them to those who we might disagree with. So again, it's very easy to set a standard that people you disagree with violate and then think negatively of them. It's much harder to apply those standards to yourself in a political world, especially where the natural instinct is to be aggressive, to attack, to marginalize for the sake of an agenda. That violates those kinds of actions, and violating any number of beliefs that we certainly want the other side to live up to. And so you kind of have to do a lot of soul searching, looking in the mirror. And before we maybe call someone out or go after someone who is violating a standard, we should probably ask ourselves, are we doing the same thing? And that doesn't necessarily mean you don't call the other person out, but it means that you better start changing yourself in addition to calling someone else out. And that's an integrity of values and of principles to be able to do that. The E in chief is for equality. And this is similar to the integrity concept, but I mean, slightly different in that we need an equality of mind towards ourselves and people who think differently than we do. The more we get to know people who are different than us, the more that it ends up changing us. And also it helps us understand how the ways that we think and talk come across to other people. And then all of a sudden you have an opportunity there in that to see someone like you see yourself. Um, when you think about, conversations you might be having, or questions you might want to ask, or things you might want to push forward, instead of just thinking about it in terms of, well, what does that mean for my cause, for people I associate with who think and live like me. You start to ask those same questions about people who think differently than you do, and not just in a strategic way to try to gain an advantage over them, but actually to make your idea, your question, your solution, whatever it is, to actually reflect them and accommodate them. And that's the equality of mind that I'm referencing there. Seeing others as you see yourself as a person. And lastly, F is for faith. And this is, the more you interact with people who are different, the more you find common goals, common humanity, common values that maybe you didn't recognize were there before, because it's very easy when you see people only through the lens of political statements or associations, or stances on issues and values. It's too easy to kind of look at them and say, oh, they're so different than me, and I can't even, how could I even have a trusting relationship with them? But then when you actually start to talk to them, and I often find out that the things that they're pursuing are actually the same goals that you have. They may be pursuing them in different ways. They may have different concerns they want to have accommodated or reflected as those goals are pursued than you do. But you end up recognizing that you're actually going in the same direction as the other, and that ultimately builds faith and trust in those people, even though, again, they think differently, or they maybe have different sets of values or different lifestyle background, life experience, whatever it is. When you find something you share, there's a connection there, and you can start to have faith in that and trust in that. And all of those things, faith, equality, integrity, humility, courage, end up, I think, being some of the foundations in which these relationships, blessed by difference, can not only be productive, but then can spread around, right? In the way that we talked earlier, because you end up having opportunities inevitably to introduce people who think differently than you do to others that are of your mindset, and vice versa, and it ends up spreading, and it can actually then create the basis for a network of these kinds of relationships that can then, from the ground up or from the bottom up, have influence on our politics, on our leaders, on our communities, in ways that then change things for the better. Back to you, Marian.
Thank you, Derek, for explaining it. I love that framework. As you were speaking, I was remembering one of the times when we worked together on something called No Promo Homo in Utah. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's the concept, the understanding within schools was that anything LGBT related couldn't be talked about within a school setting. And this was something that I've been working on for years, and I was trying to figure out how to have some impact with it, and it just seemed like I wasn't getting anywhere. So I went to my friend Derek and said, Derek, I'm concerned about this. And I think I remember at the time, Derek, that you weren't really familiar with that, or it certainly wasn't as important to you as it was to me. It wasn't top of mind for you. Am I correct?
Yeah, that was an issue we hadn't had much involvement with up to that point. I mean, I was aware of it, but it wasn't something I knew in detail, certainly, and not an issue we had worked on in detail.
Yeah. So I told Derek why it was important, and I told Derek some different stories of students and things that were happening in the world. And Derek was kind enough to bring together a group of decision makers behind the scenes who had power to affect some change within the system. And what we did was we met at Derek's offices with all these folks, and I brought one or two folks with me, and we told stories. And one of the stories we told was about a high school student who went to her guidance counselor and said, I've been kicked out of the family home. This was the wintertime. I've been kicked out because I'm LGBT. I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. And the guidance counselor thought, okay, well, with no promo homo, I can't, give any help to this girl. I'll get fired. So the guidance counselor said, well, I'm sorry. I can't help you. Good luck. And the next morning, the girl was found, she's okay. The girl was found sleeping in a snowbank in front of the high school because she wandered around for a while. Thankfully, she wasn't picked up by one of the predators that look for youth who are kicked out of the family home. But she was found in a snowbank sleeping. She was okay. But then, goodness, we can't have more of that happening in the world. So we told these stories, and I remember looking at the face of one of the folks who's seen as being a very conservative, hard voice in the world, and with just tears streaming down their face, saying, well, there's got to be something we can do about this. This isn't okay. This isn't what is supposed to happen. We need to change this. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's what I recall from that. And soon after that, I moved to New York. But whatever happened with that group, the rule got changed. And to me, that's the power of bridging, of bringing people together that may simply not know what's going on in the world, because we're all kind of in our echo chambers sometimes, and we're very interested in our issues and the things that we're concerned about, and we don't necessarily know what's happening with folks who are different from me, what's happening with folks who have things that they care about that I don't know about. So I think that's another blessing of difference, is to find out, wow, I didn't know this was happening. How can I be helpful?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that group, uh, ultimately, a lot of them ended up supporting the change to that policy, the no promo homo policy. And there was a lawsuit that was involved that was part of it too. But it wasn't the lawsuit that ultimately was the change. It was a public policy change to the legislature, which, again, a lot of those folks in that room ended up being involved with that change and being supportive of it. And that's the kind of issue that would have just divided everybody in the past. And I'm not saying it's all kumbaya, because there is still a lot of issues that come down that way and divide these same group of people that all got behind the repeal of no promo homo. But it was an illustration of, you sow some of those seeds of trust if you can have the kind of, the courage it takes to start that process and continue to follow through with it, and then it ends up leading to change, which sometimes you can't even predict. At the time when we met on that issue, the politics of it struck me as, I don't know that this law can be changed. In fact, the purpose of that group was to try to find a way to prevent what happened to that poor girl without a change in the law, because there wasn't anything about the law that says a guidance counselor can't help a child. It was just a misunderstanding of the law and a misapplication and use of it. And so we thought, well, what if we, got all the leaders around the table who could make these changes in a way that would be much more effective and quicker than trying to take on a political lightning rod issue. But then there was a lawsuit on it, and that scrambled the politics up, and that created an opening to actually change the law itself, which, so the lawsuit was part of it, but ultimately the decision to repeal the policy was a legislative one. But again, maybe the way to think about it is to say who or what would have happened if that initial meeting hadn't gone forward. It's very possible that a lot of these groups would have said, we can't cave on this. We need to stand up. So what if there's a lawsuit? We need to, stand on principle is probably how they would view it, and make a strategic decision that would have been different. But because some of those dialogues had already started, there was, of course, Sutherland stepped up and said, hey, we need to change this law. We should be for this change. We shouldn't be just fighting it just because. So that, played its part, but certainly we couldn't force anybody to get behind it. They made their own decisions on it. But because those conversations had happened, I think it maybe had some of those influences that allowed groups to coalesce around the solution that ended up changing the law itself.
Derek, have you personally, or Sutherland in general, if you can talk to this, gotten any pushback for being willing to work with LGBT folks like me?
I think at the beginning, there were questions raised about, it was just something that people were used to seeing us do. And in the nature of kind of the lightning rod nature of religious freedom and LGBTQ issues, and then the ways in which they rub up against each other, people on either side of that debate just typically don't do that kind of thing, right? And so when you do, it stands out to people, and they start to wonder, is this just something you're doing for some reason I don't understand? Are your principles changing? What is going on? And frankly, it's a sad commentary on our politics that just trying to establish a relationship with someone who thinks differently than you do is all of a sudden some potential violation of your principles. Right? It's like, oh, I'm a Christian. I always thought that, Christian love was what we're supposed to be doing, and seeing people as people. But yeah, we did get some pushback, particularly initially. And I think, part of what helped address that was when Utah got together with the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints and other groups, Equality Utah and others, and decided to take on the issue of housing and employment, and try to establish some new civil rights there that maybe hadn't existed in the past, or certainly weren't administered if they did exist, and then expand at the same time not just protections for LGBTQ individuals, but people of faith, and to try to kind of promote the concept that was called as fairness for all. And that, I think, really, really helped change some of the dynamics to where we stopped getting pushback for some of those relationships we're establishing and some of the things we're promoting and saying, because it became just, this is what everybody was doing, right? After that process. I mean, that hasn't literally been true, of course. There's been our controversies and in the state of Utah, and divides continue and things, but that particular aspect kind of went to the wayside as a matter of criticism.
So we have a question that just came in, and I'm going to read it. How have each of you successfully communicated and worked with people from different angles of an issue when all parties felt that they were firmly rooted in principles of truth and belief? That's a good question, and that gets right to the heart of what we're doing here. You want to talk to that first, Derek?
Sure. So I'll use an example of immigration. So that's another issue, that's very controversial here in America, at least. I don't know how many international people we have listening, but certainly it caused a lot of divides, and everybody thinks that they're in the right. And as a result, it's been, I don't know, decades, I guess. It feels like decades since anything significant has been resolved on that issue, and we're experiencing all the negatives of that. So about, I guess actually this would have been about a decade ago, there was a real push among states, some states, to step up and implement new laws on immigration that the federal government wasn't able to do because of politics. So the state of Arizona specifically enacted some laws where their highway patrol would start pulling people over if they thought they were undocumented and things like that, turn them over to Immigration and Customs, and lead to deportation and all those kinds of things. And we kind of summed it up as the round them up and ship them out kind of approach. And we, as a conservative organization, at a fundamental level, thought that was not right, both from a human perspective, certainly from from folks who've really not violated some moral, ethical law by crossing an imaginary line, trying to make their lives better, or to flee a really dangerous situation in a lot of cases. And so does that level of response make any sense? Because they're not criminals in the typical sense that we would think of a criminal. But also from just the practical perspective, as a conservative, the idea of state law enforcement basically being deputized to be federal law enforcement officers is wrong, like is a violation of the principle of federalism. So there's various angles at which we thought this isn't right. And we had to start with our own organization. Our own board was divided on the issue. And it took us about a year of working through why the conservative approach ought to be different than what was going on in a state like Arizona. But we were able to figure that out. And then there was going outside the organization and trying to persuade others how and why should we take a different approach. And part of this wasn't instigated by Sutherland, but it ended up leading to a meeting of folks in the business world, folks in law enforcement, folks in political leaders, think tank individuals like Sutherland and others. And we just started talking, not sure what this was going to lead to. And we found that we actually had shared goals. Despite the different, perspectives we brought, law enforcement had real concerns about, for example, the presence of not the presence of undocumented individuals, but what those communities naturally did in response to law enforcement. And it's not that they did heinous things, but oftentimes they would disengage from law enforcement because they're understandably worried that what that might lead to, not necessarily understanding that a state police officer is not someone who's necessarily going to turn you over to the feds, but that's stuff that not many people understand, and regardless of your documentation status. So we started having those conversations, and again, what came out of it was we all had a shared interest in the human aspects of that policy and a lot of the philosophical aspects of that policy, at least in terms of broad scope. And that led to a document which ended up being, called the Utah Compromise, and the Utah Compact. And it was a statement of principles. It led to legislation that took a different tack than Arizona, and frankly, it swung public opinion. Before that effort started, there was some public polling that suggested Utahns supported doing what Arizona is doing by a 60-40 margin. And then by the time all the Utah Compact stuff came about and the legislation went through, it was a 60-40 support for the compact, which was the opposite of what Arizona was doing. And so, I mean, it's a long-winded answer, but I think it starts with just sitting down and having conversations with people and listening to them, right? Like not just having conversations with people with this kind of guarded defensiveness and trying to pick apart what someone's saying to see how it's wrong, which is the natural response in kind of the divisive politics that we have today. But to say, you know what, I'm going to go into this conversation thinking I probably don't understand a lot that I think I do. I don't know what those things are, but they're probably there. I'm going to listen to this person. I'm going to, or this group of people, if it's a group, and see how what they're saying conflicts with what my experience is or what my thinking is, and then investigate what they said on its own merits, not from the perspective of somebody said something that kind of conflicts with your thoughts, and you're looking for try to pick apart to see how it must be wrong because obviously what you think is right. Again, that's that humility coming back, right? In the chief framework, you can look at it and say, okay, this is different than what I think. Why is that the case? Is there something in what they're saying that helps me recognize how I'm wrong? What I thought was true is incorrect, or a life experience that is partially true but doesn't reflect the whole kind of totality of society? Those kinds of questions. And I think once that process gets going and all parties are engaging in it, and this is the part where things can get tough because you can't control how other people are going to engage. But if you can get a group of people, and again, going back to what we said earlier, this is why it's helpful if you have one person in the room that everybody trusts, because it lets a lot of guards down, especially if that person is kind of coordinating or facilitating the discussion. But if you do that, then I think it ends up starting the process of change. People end up walking away with a lot to think about and reflect on. And if you can continue that, if people are willing to engage that process, not just in one conversation, but over a longer period, then I think you can start to push through some of the divides, some of the kind of intransigence in belief systems, to then see each other as you see yourself, and then start to find ways, in fact, that you actually agree on something that you thought you would never agree on in an area that you thought was a complete divisive thing, like immigration or religious freedom or LGBTQ rights or whatever it is, and end up pursuing a policy that ends up changing things, or if not even a policy issue, right? I work in a policy think tank, so that's where my brain naturally goes. But maybe it's going into a community and just solving a problem, and changing things for the better.
I agree. And one thing that you said that I particularly agree with is the curiosity part. Because I recall over the years, you and I have talked about different issues. We'll be together and you'll say, or I'll say, oh, what do you think about X? And then trading thoughts about things. And I know over the years, sometimes my hackles will be raised a little bit by something you say. And I've learned to be curious about that when I find myself reacting to just kind of settle down a bit and say, well, tell me more about that, Derek. And I've learned to do that with other people as well. So I have something that I call building bridges through digging tunnels. How can we find that thing that connects us even across this divide that seems too much? And whether it's marriage equality or whether it's gun control, any of those hot button issues, I think if we dig deep enough, we can find that, okay, we all want people to live in loving families. We all want people safe from violence, things like that. And then finding those places in common where we can work together on things. And that was my experience around youth homelessness, and my person was Laura Warburton, to bring her up again. We totally disagreed on just about everything you could think of. But what we agreed on was the fact that no child should be sleeping in the woods. And she got all of her Relief Society people together to donate hundreds of warm coats and help to get the laws changed in Utah. And we still didn't agree on a lot of things. And one day, Laura and I were sitting together. We were about to do an interview on youth homelessness. And I looked over and Laura had tears streaming down her face. And Laura and I had become friends by then from working together. And I said, Laura, what's wrong? And Laura said, I don't think your being married to a woman is okay. It goes against my religious belief. I think it's wrong. And what she was saying was, I'm thinking that we can't be friends anymore because you'll be so angry at me for saying this to you. And what I said to Laura was, Laura, I've known that you felt that way. And I totally respect your religious beliefs. And my religious beliefs means that I get married to my wife. And we are beautiful friends and we all love each other. So even across these faith differences, these differences of principle that are so important, I mean, absolutely important, they guide my life, but also these bonds of friendship and love and compassion and passion about working on an issue together. I think actually having a commitment to faith and principles that's different is a strength. And that's why I call it Blessed by Difference, because even though we're so different, it's those differences together that make us much more effective in getting work done in the world, I think. So I appreciate that question. I had a breakthrough last year. I was speaking at the United Nations Civil Society Conference, and I talked about being an LGBT person of faith, which a lot of people have never heard of before. And one woman stood up and she said in front of the group, well, and she was pointing at me, she said, well, you just want to change my theology, don't you? You want my theology to be so that gay people are okay and that gay marriage is okay, don't you? And that caught me off guard because I hadn't ever thought about it that way. But I was glad that she asked the question, because then I had a moment of clarity. And I said to her something that now I say over and over again, because I believe it's true for me. And that is, no, I don't want to change your theology. That your walk with your faith, that is yours. I have my own walk with my faith. I am not going to try to change your theology, and you can never change my theology. That's my relationship with God. And isn't it beautiful that we both have that? Our job together is to figure out how we can respect each other. How can we promote each other's flourishing in the world? How can we help keep vulnerable people safe in the world? That we can do together. We don't need to change each other. We can learn from each other, and we can support each other, and we can work together. And that's what I pledge myself to do.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that actually pertains to the question that was asked too. It's been a while since we wrote that op-ed on the chief thing, and if I was going to augment it, I think I would add something. It doesn't really work because the letter doesn't fit into the word, but something about acceptance of difference. Just going into a relationship or an interaction without the desire to change them, because that, like, the natural presupposition there is there something wrong that you need to change in them, and that's not the kind of relationship that's going to last. I mean, think about it this way, right? If you go into a marriage and one of your primary things is, okay, how am I going to change my spouse? Yeah, you're going to have a lot of counseling, a lot of issues, right? because because that's just not how successful marriages are. Now, in successful marriages, people change, but it's typically not a process of one spouse, going in and explicitly changing the other. It's a little more of a humble approach of, you learn about each other, get to understand the ways in which you're different, and ways you still need to love and support each other, and that forces you to change because you love the other person, and you want to be there for them. I think it's similar in this kind of relationship, blessed by difference or cross difference. People do end up changing, but typically not because you go in wanting to change them. Because I don't know, maybe it's just my theory on this, but your motivations matter, and oftentimes they come to the surface. So even if you don't go in saying explicitly, I want to change you, it will come out in how you interact with them, right? And the ways, little subtle things of how you speak to them, or how you respond to them, and things like that. And trying to convert people is fine and good. I'm not criticizing that, but it's certainly not if that's your primary motive in an interaction or relationship, it's not going to be one, I think, that leads to kind of productive long-term friendship. And it probably won't even be the best way to change them. Like I said, I think oftentimes when people change, it's because they recognize something themselves and then take action to change, not because somebody tried to manipulate them or change them or shame them into being different, or whatever it is, argue them down into becoming different. And so it's another way to deal with people who all think that they're in the right, is you don't go in trying to change them, and that ends up being very disarming, right? It ends up, I think, taking away some of the defensiveness, because they're expecting you to come in guns a-blazing, trying to change them, and you're sitting there listening and trying to understand them and recognizing the humanity in them. And if they're like, oh, this is not what I'm expecting, who is this person? Now I want to know more about them, because that wasn't what I was expecting. What's going on here now? And now it ends up being reciprocal response of curiosity, I think, when we go into it the right way.
You're exactly right. And I remember Arthur C. Brooks, who Sutherland had do a fabulous event, and I love his books. One of the most important things I learned from him, and he said it that night at the event that I went to, that Sutherland hosted, was, if you want to change someone's mind, the way to do it is to listen to them. And I think he's exactly right. If by being curious and by asking questions, people will talk and they will share and they will explain, and that's beautiful, because I always learn so much when I listen to people. But then they do become curious. They want to know what you think. And then that's the opportunity then to share a story, I always suggest not trying to overwhelm with data and stats, because the facts tend to set people back into their own beliefs. They don't want to be confronted with another set of facts that don't make sense. But if you can tell a story that sheds light on a topic in a new way, then people get more and more curious. Like our story of no promo homo with the girl sleeping in the snow. Well, how can that be? Tell me more. Why is it like that? How can we change it? It's the stories that break people open to want to learn more and to collaborate together and to brainstorm to figure out how they can come to a solution that everyone agrees with and everyone wants to be part of.
I wonder, just to be maybe more topically relevant, right, to what we're dealing with today, and we mentioned this earlier, I think, Marian, I think, did, but, the response to COVID-19, to coronavirus, I think has been a perfect example of a lot of these things. When you look at, if you just took all the facts out, the particular details, and said there was an issue that is going to lead federal, state, and local elected leaders, regardless of party, regardless of geography, regardless of ideology, to all approach an issue with a similar goal and outcome and work in a coordinated effort, not necessarily explicitly coordinated, but coordinated in the sense that states are mostly pursuing the same kinds of policies in the public health response. I think if you ask today, is that even possible? Everyone would say no, but we're living it right now. And I think it's because the nature of the public health concern has been one that's united everybody around a shared goal, and it's kind of risen above a lot of the divides that we have. And in fact, we recently, Southern recently put something out on this, talking about actually it's a lot of concern for today, obviously, and obviously everybody's hearts go out to people whose relatives have gotten sick, those who, God forbid, have had relatives die or loved ones die. And all of that is terrible. But thinking to the future, I think actually one thing that the response has, at least for me, has actually given me cause for hope, that there are still things that we can rise above our divides about. And the trick, I guess, is figuring out how to not do so only when there's a pandemic, right? Or how to take the principles, how the things that we've learned, maybe the relationships that have been established as people have pursued the public health goals in response to coronavirus, and then go and say, okay, well, that's something we can build upon, right? And let's do that now in other issues that are more controversial, more difficult. And maybe you start with the ones, honestly, the ones that haven't been so controversial in the past that have become so, like passing a budget, right? Like at a federal level or something that's kind of mundane on its face, but it's become very difficult. And then, kind of start to turn the tide on things that are more controversial over time. And so I think, anyways, I really think there is, amidst all of the divides that do happen and the difficulty, there is really a sense for hope in the life experience we're having right now. If we you have to take something of an optimistic approach, obviously, and find the moments where good things are happening and be able to export those lessons to other areas. But it can happen, and it is happening. Now we need to learn from it and get better.
Absolutely. We had a question that was submitted before we started, so I want to be sure that we get that in. Has there ever been an issue that you couldn't agree on, or an issue that was especially hard?
What do you think, Marian?
I think the one that was really hard for me was when we were talking about sex ed in schools, you and I, because I think we were coming from, and often we do come from really different perspectives and have different different ideas about things, which is great. I love that, because I love being able to get in touch with you and say, I do not understand anyone having this opinion on this topic. Can you explain it to me? and you do, and I appreciate that. But I think it was, the topic was sex ed in schools, because I had a very particular perspective on it and still do. And I remember what you said about it, and I was like, oh, I thought he was my friend. How could he have that opinion? And then I settled down a little bit and said, well, can you explain that to me? And you did, saying that, you know, and just to paraphrase you, correct me if I'm wrong, saying that, well, I, as a parent of faith, I want to be able to have these conversations with my children at home. I don't want someone else having these conversations. And as a mom myself, you know, that made perfect sense to me. And so then I add more nuance to it, rather than just seeing it as an issue that was right and wrong, and I was right and you were wrong. So that was mine. Do any stand out to you?
Well, I think that's a really good one. I know, and I don't know, we need to go into all the detail on this because I I can't remember all the detail myself, but um, there was an interaction we had about kind of what the sources of homophobia are. Um,
Oh,
you remember
yeah,
those
we
those
still need
emails?
to finish that conversation, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's maybe one reason not to get into all the detail because we haven't finished it ourselves. But you know, that's one I think where um, it led to there were some sharp differences I think there, and the email exchanges. Um, so this might be an example actually of there are some topics that you probably don't go into in a relationship that's has differences, you know, initially, right? You don't go, you don't jump right onto the controversial things that you know are going to cause, you know, you have to build some trust first, and then it creates that environment where you can dig deeper on some of these things. And this is probably one of those topics. But I remember there were some sharp differences that, you know, in a different kind of relationship that maybe wasn't as deep or wasn't as lasting or hadn't been as constructive would have, yeah, maybe raised questions for me of like, maybe we should stop interacting or something. I don't know, because you just don't want to, you know, have constant disagreements that maybe get heated. Um, but in the context of this relationship with Marian and I think it became it's like, oh, that's interesting. So help me understand that. Like because here's what I'm thinking, and but what are you seeing that I'm not, right? And um, so as you go into, maybe this is a practical recommendation, as you go into trying to create a relationship across difference, uh, you know, maybe put some thought into what issues do I not need to not talk about for a little while, even though they might be the very issue that you really want to get to. It just might be something you need to wait for a few weeks or months or I don't know how long to really dive to it. But if it's really that important, it should be worth the wait, I think. Um, and again, because it's about the other person as much as it is about you. But yeah, that's another one, I think.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think it's often really better to not dive into something where you know you're miles apart, because it can just destroy a relationship, when, particularly if there isn't trust and a good base of care for each other there. One thing that I've done over the years, Derek, that you may not have noticed, I don't think you and I have ever really debated the gay thing. But I've invited you to care with me about things like LGBT youth suicide, homelessness, no promo homo, different things like that, where we could find that we both cared deeply about it, but we didn't. We're dancing around the topic of homophobia and where that comes from, but you and I have never, debated that. But we've been able to work together on things that are related to that issue that I care so deeply about. And I suspect that we have tremendous theological differences in lots of different ways. And I love that about you, actually. I really do, because that brings that added dimension to my life. You know, it's wonderful to have that relationship with someone where I can learn things all the time. I really appreciate that about you.
Thank you. Well, and I mean, I think I know we're getting close to our time, but last thing I guess I'll say is the thing that stood out to me was what you just said about the invitation to care about humanity, right? Yeah, while we maybe haven't gotten into the theological differences on same-sex attraction and same-sex relationships and all of that, um, we've spent a lot of time just caring about people. And again, that's, to me, that's where some of these eye-opening moments of people who think and believe and have different values start to happen, because it's too easy in the world we live in, where oftentimes a lot of our friends, be they in person or online, are similar to us in various ways. It's too easy to kind of get into this kind of comfort zone, thinking that the other side doesn't even care about people, right? I mean, because if all you base it on is their anonymous social media statements or political or policy statements, yeah, it probably doesn't seem like they care about people. But then when you actually start to interact with them and find out not only do they care about people, there's a lot of different ways they're actually maybe trying to do things to help the very people you think they don't care about. Or if that's not happening, they're certainly willing, and maybe they just don't have the tools to go about that, but you do, and you invite them in, and they're more than willing. They're excited to jump into that. Yeah, again, all of a sudden now you're dealing with a human being, in your own mind. And so when you then come back to some of those maybe more controversial statements, you can't objectify them back into that box you used to have them in, because you know better, they care about people. And so that's just an opportunity to be curious and ask a question. But why do you think that, or why are you saying this? Because it seems like you really care about people, but to me, this comes across as something as maybe not being caring, or whatever, however the phrasing of it's going to be. And then you start to learn about each other, as long as you're applying the principles, right, of listening and all of that. So yeah, start with human beings. Everybody really cares about human beings, most people, when you get down to it. And you can build from there.
Absolutely. I agree. I think my biggest tip when someone asks me what's a tip for bridging, I say make a friend who's very, very different from you. And it all starts from there. It all starts with relationship and curiosity, and I would say compassion as well. Well, thank you for those of you who have been with us today. Thank you so much. We will be sending out an email to you with our contact information in case you have follow-up questions or things we can be helpful with. And we'll also send out a couple of handouts as well. I have tips for talking and Derek's chief framework and some different things. I appreciate your being here. Derek, thank you for this conversation today. It's always great to see you.
Yeah, thank you, Marian. Appreciate the chance. And for everybody who's hosted and been a part of, getting this going with the UN and others since the UN kind of switch, appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Keep safe, everyone. And thank you again. Bye-bye.